He says change is on my agenda, eyes bright, voice steady, the rhetorical weight falling on that word good as if he intends to carve it into stone. But listen a little longer, past the applause line, past the clean soundbite trimmed for social feeds, and you hear an undertone that royal lifers recognize instantly: not revolution, calibration. Not smashing the porcelain, dusting it, rearranging the shelf, and calling that the new room. The Earthshot CEO, Jason North, doesn't even pretend otherwise. He gifts the line that decodes the whole project: this is the way William wants to lead now and later, updating tradition so it still works. Not the bonfire of the vanities, the workshop of the air. The comparison to his father lands with a quiet, surgical accuracy. Charles, the Prince of Letters and Hedgerows, learned the hard lesson of the late 20th century. Only the changes that keep the machine recognizable will outlive the man proposing them. William appears to have inherited that law, not just the crest. Start with the setting that unlocked his candor, Eugene Levy's travel series, a format built for gentle disarming rather than adversarial cross-examination. The heir arrives on an e-scooter, Windsor as playground and archive, storytelling in the language of corridors and lawns. We hear about children and dinner tables, about the ban on phones, about a home atmosphere engineered to feel safe because the nation's oldest public family cannot afford chaos in the private rooms that keep the public face steady. Then comes the modernizer's thesis: change, but not overly radical, renewal, not rupture. To fans who've read too many headlines about a cautious King Charles, this sounds like a generational pivot. To those who've actually watched Windsor politics, it reads as continuity dressed in breathable fabric. You don't rip out the beams that are holding the roof over your head, you wrap them, lighten the paint, and add windows where the light can do most good. This is precisely how Charles lived his pre-throne life, controversial when he spoke out on architecture and environment, yes, but careful to alchemize that passion into institutions that could survive him: duchy projects, organic farming, charities that channeled critique into action. William's Earthshot is cut from the same timber, right down to the rhetorical pace. Urgent optimism. Solutions that exist, if we scale them. 2030 as a threshold future generations will judge us by. The heir as convener and amplifier. A prize that borrows the grammar of Oscar's night to sell impact rather than box office. Tradition updated, honors culture fits a climate decade. It's not rebellious, it's cunning. The Crown has always loved awards because they let it outsource the sermon. William is simply speaking that fluent language to a new audience, and North, the professional translator, says the quiet part without shame: the innovation is the vehicle, not the destination. The destination is the same one Elizabeth and Charles steered toward: continuity that feels current. And note the discipline of his caveats. Not overly radical. In a soundbite economy, those three words are a safety rail. They tell civil servants he won't crash the protocols that make their days predictable. They reassure donors that the brand they've stapled reputations to will not turn punk overnight. They temper the hopes of those who want him to torch old rooms. The monarchy isn't a startup, it's a nuclear plant. You don't yank out rods because social media wants a vibe shift. You alter the coolant flow, update the control software, train the next generation of technicians, and you do it without ever using the word meltdown. That is the Windsor school of change. Charles practiced it. William is pledging it. Consider how insiders frame it when they take off their ties and relax into metaphor. It's like Doctor Who, one aide tells the broadsheets. Completely different but a bit the same. That is the doctrine of successful. Hereditary power in a modern democracy: regeneration that preserves silhouette, timbre, and theme. A new face, fresh pacing, altered color grading, but the protagonist remains exactly who you think he is the moment he steps into the frame: duty in a well-cut suit. The trick is to keep the country feeling both seen and soothed. Charles, for all the chatter about caution, did precisely that in his first years: stability when health headlines might have licensed drama, green retrofits at Windsor rather than roaring treatises, a tighter working core that looked like reform but functioned like maintenance. William's interviews, when they are honest, own the plan. He wants what his grandmother achieved and his father attempted: a crown that is recognizably itself, told with updated storytelling. That is not a bug. It's the only way the software runs. It's also why William's more confessional notes in the Levi conversation were so carefully ring-fenced. Change excites me. Yes. Family first. Also yes. I will not make the same marriage mistakes my parents did. A vow not to the nation but to 3 children whose dinners are a nightly referendum on whether the Windsors learned anything from the 1990s. The admission that history does not overwhelm him but family stress does is not a throwaway flourish, it's the framework within which his change for good will live. He will push where the public agrees: environment, early years, homelessness framed as solvable systems, and he will clamp down where the cameras threaten to turn his living room into a court of public opinion. The hybrid is classic Windsor, the open window that shows you the curated view, not the private garden. Earthshot again is the cleanest case study. Watch how it works when you strip away the event glitter. You take a prize model that the palace knows how to stage: red carpet, suspense, 5 envelopes, you pack it with scientists and entrepreneurs who can shoulder the narrative weight, and you export the thing to cities that buy into the spectacle because spectacle still moves civic needles. Then you list a year countdown, 2030, loud enough to be a drumbeat, and you talk about climate not as apocalypse but as engineering problems with heroes attached. Charles built that grammar. William is just deploying it with a smoother social strategy and a sharper TikTok sense for edit beats. And yet the core is Dad's, the Crown as platform for practical idealism, never losing the plot that the Crown endures by appearing useful. Critics will say this is timid when the planet's on fire, the polls trend soft among the under 35s, and the media economy rewards heat, not harmony. They will ask, where is the radical that bends curves instead of speeches? The answer the palace has baked into William's words is deliberately boring. Radical is what survives. If you want sustained impact, build machines that withstand personnel changes. The King's people put it blunter: the institution survives by being both the same and different. Which is another way of saying, aesthetics change, the contract doesn't. You show up, you serve, you keep the show on the road, and you renovate while the theatre is open. There is a human subtext that makes this philosophy less bloodless than it sounds. William's last 12 months were publicly labelled the hardest of his life. A father and a wife, both facing cancer, 3 young children absorbing news that no child should have to pass, a job that punishes hesitation with headlines. Out of that furnace came a man who speaks about security with the intensity of someone who watched the floor wobble. The no phones at dinner line isn't prissy, it's protective architecture. The insistence that the family has coping mechanisms isn't motivational poster stuff, it's a description of a crisis plan. In that context, not overly radical reads not like cowardice but triage. You change the bits you can change without breaking the bits that keep the people you love steady. So what, specifically, will change for good look like if this is the theology? Expect edits to how the monarchy shows its homework. More behind-the-scenes craft, less balcony melodrama. Patronage work that comes with measurable goals and quarterly updates, as Earthshot already models. A Wales operation that treats digital not as a distribution channel but as a classroom, small explanations folded into big moments so the public feels looped in rather than preached at. A crown that reduces the parade of marginal royals and invests that time in fewer faces with clearer missions, so the brand equity stops leaking through the edges. Expect also the slow recalibration of geography: Windsor as base culture for family life, London retained for statecraft and theatre. That too mirrors Charles' instincts: retreat from relentless urban heat for the sake of sustainability, carbon and emotional, then pop back into the capital for moments that require majesty. Do not expect a public reconciliation choreography designed for catharsis with the Sussexes. In William's belief system, change is not the moment you give the press a hug. Change is the pattern your diary makes when you stop feeding dramas. The modernizing move will be to let absence be eloquent and to redirect oxygen to work that tangibly benefits constituencies the Crown needs to keep. It will be read by some as ice. It will be defended by others as boundary. It is, unmistakably, the playbook Charles has used with the York question in a different register: reduce proximity, reduce platform, reduce the chance of collateral damage, and keep the working core relentless. The most telling line in the advisor chorus isn't the Doctor Who gag, it's the reminder that each monarch must be completely different but a bit the same. That is the compromise hereditary power demands of its protagonists. Elizabeth's genius was to make that sentence invisible. Charles's project has been to prove you can be a cautious innovator after a youthful season of public convictions. William's project is the inverse, to grow from a cautious Prince of Wales into a king who presents as a vocal advocate for targeted change, climate, early years, mental health, without misdiagnosing commentary as governance. If he pulls it off, historians will write that his change for good was a method, not a mood. There's a corollary the palace understands even if it seldom says aloud: the monarchy's health is measured not in sentiment but in throughput. How many visits that don't trend still change budgets? How many introductions that never make a headline still unlock research dollars or regulation shifts? Earthshot's less photographed weeks, the matchmaking between finalists and funders, the quiet policy briefings that turn a pilot into a procurement are where William's seriousness will be judged by grown-ups. That's exactly how Charles wanted his horticulture and heritage fights to be graded. The sun is simply swapping oak beams for carbon math and calling the exam by a different name. Change for good also means killing the changes that waste energy. Expect an even tighter veto on initiatives that feel clever but cannibalize bandwidth. Expect more ruthless sequencing. No new ribbon until the last ribbon's impact report arrives. Expect staff empowered to say no earlier, so failure dies in a room rather than on a stage. The Crown can withstand scandal, it cannot withstand trend-chasing. William, on current evidence, gets that. He wants people who can show receipts, not just showreels. Will this satisfy the impatient? Of course not. The impatient want a monarchy that behaves like a startup when its very mandate is to behave as a utility, quiet, reliable, occasionally beautiful, always on. But utilities that modernize their infrastructure without blackouts are rare, and when they do it well, the public forgets the system needed maintenance at all. In that forgetting lies the Crown's odd victory. You remember the wedding, the balcony, the lines of flags, you barely notice the rewiring of the grid. Charles spent a lifetime teaching himself to be the kind of man who could manage that unglamorous pride. William, one suspects, admires the lesson even as he updates the signage. Which brings us back to the oak tree, to 2030, and to the way the heir frames urgency without surrendering to panic. Halfway through the decisive decade, the rhetoric sharpens, the threshold by which future generations will judge us, the idea that our actions or lack of them will lock the planet's trajectory. That is not the language of a ceremonial caretaker. It is the vocabulary of a project manager who knows timelines matter. But listen to the cadence, and it still sounds like the family business, calm, forward-leaning, a touch of theatre wrapped around a core of logistics. The grandmother would recognize it. The father has practiced it with varying success. The son is running it through a cleaner microphone. So, yes, change is on his agenda. But the deeper truth is less tweetable and more interesting. William is not promising a new monarchy, he is promising a monarchy that learns. That takes the parts that worked under Elizabeth, silence, stamina, the parts that were worth salvaging from Charles's long apprenticeship, serious causes, long horizons, and adds a layer of contemporary competence that turns royal attention into multipliers. If it feels familiar, that's the point. The institution regenerates by convincing the public that sameness is a kind of kindness, a steady hand on a crowded wheel, while the wiring hums with upgrades you only notice when the lights never flicker. That is how the Crown has always smuggled change past the culture wars, competence with a little ceremony on the side. If the heir can keep that ratio honest, if Earthshot remains a machine for scaling rather than a mirror for selfies, if family life stays protected enough that the public sees stability instead of spectacle, if not overly radical becomes code for sustainably transformational, then history will call his agenda exactly what he hopes it will be called. Not a copy. A continuity that works.